So I went to my cool site called crispytopics.com. I asked my friend Nelson to build up my website for me, and what it is, and you can go there free and you can see it. Crispytopics.com has got recordings for security people. And what I say to people is, if you want to get access to these recordings, just give me your real account. You can't use a Gmail account. You need to give me your corporate information and create an account with me that's real, and then you can have access to this. It's all free. I just want the ability to market to you. And then a little while later, like about a year after Crispy Topics was stood up, I went and I was Googling around and I saw a link, a direct link to the site and to a recording on Google. I'm like, oh my God, there's a direct link to that recording. I clicked on it and sure enough, the recording started to play. Oh my God. So anybody can get to this and they don't have to authenticate, and then I have no tracking mechanism whether these recordings are good or not. I called up Nelson. I said, Nelson, what's going on? He goes, nothing. He says, everything's fine. I said, but no, I clicked on a link and it drove me directly to there. He said, did you go to Crispy Topics before that and actually authenticate? I said, yeah. He goes, well, it cached your credentials. He says, try and do the same link from another machine where you haven't authenticated at this point. So I quickly flipped over my VM over to my Mac machine, and sure enough, I clicked the Google link and boom, authenticate me. He had restricted access to the particular URL. Even though you know the URL, you still have to authenticate. When you fail to restrict URL access, then those site searches that Google does will populate in their database and you won't authenticate. So we want people to authenticate for every access to every part of the site at that point. So, for instance, here, in failure to restrict URL access, this illustration, you'll notice that a user is allowed to get their account. What happens if we change the name? They're authenticated. What happens if we change the name from user to administrator, like get accounts under admin? Will it require us to authenticate again? And if the answer is yes, then great. If the answer is no, you've failed to restrict URL access. What would be the forensics data that we would see inside of this server here? Again, you would see somebody coming in, you'd see an accepted request. The HTTP log would say, here, this information is good. You decided to go to an inappropriate place that you're not supposed to, but I haven't restricted you from. Again, you'd request and I'd fulfill that request and everything would be just fine. So we wouldn't see a lot from a forensic standpoint. But back in here, if you took that next step, that once you got into the administrative and you started playing around, then what would happen in the database back here is I would see that access and that would be logged for all that activity that you did. It may be on the web server that I see the resulting documentation going back to you and I know about that you went to the admin section and you looked at all the admin accounts and you changed user accounts. Pieces of that would be in the database back there and pieces of that request, send and receive request, would be in the web server here. So you'd see that forensically there. Insufficient transport layer protection. This won't be seen in any logging mechanism whatsoever. If I don't, on my web server, force you to use SSL or TLS, and I use weaker encryption or I make up my own encryption, nothing's going to be revealed here whatsoever. Because probably I'm going to see that you talked to me and everything was fine and we had our issues back and forth and we communicated, and then you used that to gain access to the custom code or the back-end system, or you got to my web partners or my employees. You would have gone straight back through there and gained that access, and I would never see it. If you went to those sites and there was an SSL certificate on them, and there's the authentication there, then again, I would see that generated on that web server, but not the original public-facing web server at that point. So make sure that you have the SSL in place, use the correct certificates. If you're doing any kind of, let's go back for a second, if you're doing any kind of business partner communication back and forth, you may even say to the business partners, we want you to have a client-side certificate for that access, so therefore evildoers coming in would have to also match up those certificates. And then what we would see in the web logs here is we would see inappropriate or mismatched authentication or no client-side certificate authentication. That would generate a lot of data on the web server here. So we really want to avoid this by putting in SSL or TLS wherever it is needed. That would be the fix for this. Unvalidated redirectors and forwarders. So user-supplied parameters, take a look at the slide here. User-supplied parameters in the destination URL request data from unauthorized sites. And the attacker can send the victim to the site of their choice. Where we see this is in redirectors and forwarders, we see this in transfers to other websites, usually in .NET. Let's take a look at the diagram here. We're looking at the redirectors first. So the attacker sends you an email that you reply to. The victim clicks that link to that unvalidated parameter. They'll go to the original site, and then they'll also retrieve information from the evil site. So they've been redirected to an inappropriate location. That required that the end user act on some sort of farming or phishing attack, and that the evil server was connected in some way through that URL link. In that unvalidated redirector, we again wouldn't see anything forensically on the server side for our web server because all the attack information went from the evildoer site to the client. There would be no data generated by us, but we would get a complaint from our customer. In the forwarder, what we would convince the attacker would do is they would convince the end user to go to a different site that looked like our site. Here, forensically, we would see nothing. We would only get a complaint from the customer. We want to avoid these redirectors and forwarders as best we possibly can. If you're going to use redirectors and forwarders, make sure that your customers know it, but you really can't fight somebody who's not coming to your site, and you really can't protect your customers if they're going to an evil location. So it's unlikely that we're going to be able to help and support in this way, except for to apologize to the client and tell them they shouldn't be going to farming and fishing sites. That's the best we could probably do. That's the OWASP Top 10, and now we're going to dig into more of the forensics information in this next section.